Oh, so yeah, they are not
tuko tu wawili kwa hii class.
Dini form 3. Fungua tu hiyo.
Hiyo. Alafu kitu ile download ndio hiyo. Umeiona hiyo?
Utafungua.
Ukifungua utaniwekea hapo.
So, laptop yako unatumia?
Hapana.
Nilikuwa nataka ni administrate nayo, kama unatumia hii ni administrate nayo mkutano ya form 1.
Iko sawa.
Net iko nayo? Sasa I need something to administrate your form 1.
Na form 4 umeset?
Form 4 already class imeendelea.
Umeset? Lakini sasa mimi hapa ukikaa hapa uweze kuwa hapa si bado unaweza Sao? Numero resisting. Numero resisting. Numero resisting. Everybody go.
Sekta za utalii, madini na kilimo. Haya na mengine mengi.
Madam Agnes, can you unmute? Okay.
Hello?
You can continue. We can
Okay,
hear
so I can
you.
start. Huh?
Yeah, you can start.
Thank you. Good morning, Form Force. I believe you're doing well. Today I would want to take you through revision of Form 1 work, and particularly oral literature. And I would want us to look at oral narratives. This is revision. For that reason, this is what we are just going through. It may seem very easy to you, but it is important that we go through it once again together. Oral narratives. We know we have various categories of oral narratives. Hello, we have various categories of oral narratives, beginning with trickster narratives. I hope the class, you are there, class. I believe you are there. We have the legends, myths, dilemma narratives, etiological narratives. And I'm sure you'd give me the list of all the list of all the narratives. Okay. I hope we are together. I do hope we are together. Hello, I hope I'm communicating, Francis.
Yeah, you are communicating well and good. Everything is okay on your side and also on our side.
I would want to see the students. Is it not possible? So that I can.
The students have muted their videos. They are just left their name. So most of them have just switched off their video cameras.
Oh.
So it is not possible for us to view their videos.
Okay, it's okay then. I just wanted to know that.
Yeah.
So I can continue?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Now we have the various types of narratives, the legends, the myths, the dilemma, etiological narratives, also called explanatory narratives, trickster narratives, ogre narratives. Which other ones? We also have the fables. Now, I do know you know all these types of narratives, but one thing I need to mention is about the fables. That is the only narrative I'll mention. The fables, we have said again and again that you'll only use this category if it cannot fit any other category. For example, a trickster narrative is a fable. A dilemma narrative could be a fable, because a fable is those stories that have animals as characters and they have a moral lesson. So any other type of narrative could be a fable. So unless it does not qualify any other, so this classification is only used when it is very clear that the narrative has no specific category to be classified under. Underline that fables can only, you can only say that a story is a fable if it cannot be a trickster, if it is not a dilemma narrative, if it is not a noga narrative. So it is the only time that you'd say that a story is a fable. Like I said, this is revision. And the next thing I would want to look at, because revision is what you have already done, the features of narratives, the features of narratives, the features of oral narratives. We have many, but it is important that we look at those features that are unique, those features that are unique for oral narratives, features that are unique of oral narratives, that when you read a story, you would say, this is indeed an oral narrative. It is not any other type of narrative. And the most dominant ones are the ones I'm going to mention, because yeah, you can get at least 5 features. Number 1, we have the opening formula. The opening formula, once upon a time, that's one example. Once there lived, or simply there lived, or one day, or what you would call timelessness. Timelessness. And timelessness is because when we say once upon a time, so the story is timeless. That is feature number 1. So another feature of oral narratives is the closing formula. And they lived happily ever after. And they lived happily ever after. For example, and my story ends there. And my story ends there. And that is a closing formula. Then another feature is use of dialogue. Use of dialogue. In a story, you'd find animals. For example, if it's a trickster narrative, we have the hyena speaking to the hare. Yes, the hyena is speaking to the hare. So that is, there could be a dialogue. And in an exam situation, it is very important that you identify the speakers. Identify the speakers. Then quote the lines of the dialogue. Because, well, it's good to keep mentioning for you to get a full mark. You need to have the illustrations clearly put. Number 3. That is number 3, dialogue is number 3. We also have fantasy. Fantasy, the use of fantasy. For example, in ogre narratives, for example, we have ogres who are able to transform from one form to another. So that is fantasy. We would have also animals speaking. Animals have families. So this is fantasy. So it is not real. It is just imagination, and hence fantasy. Excuse me. Now, we also have personification. When animals are given character traits of human beings, we say this is personification. Personification. So this is another feature that is unique to oral narratives. Then use of idiophones. For example, the ogres were moving pata, pata, pata. So that is an idiophone. That is an idiophone. Yes, idiophones, or he drank the porridge, do. So that is an idiophone. So if there is the presence of such, you are able to know this is actually an oral narrative. Then we have repetition. Repetition. Yeah, there could be repetition of sentences or something was done repeatedly. He dug and dug and dug. They walked and walked and walked. So that is repetition. And again, another feature of oral narratives. Then the use of vernacular. The use of vernacular. Yeah, you could have vernacular words. That is another feature of oral narrative. There could also be use of song. So those are the main, there could be others, but those are the main features of an oral narrative that you can tell that this story was originally an oral narrative. Yes. And then this does not mean that every other story that you read will have all these features. Not every story will have a song. Not every story will have an opening formula. So do not just memorize and just imagine. And that's why illustration is very, very important. That is why illustration is important, because, for example, if you say there's an opening formula and the story does not have an opening formula, this you have to illustrate. In other words, you have to illustrate to show that indeed the opening formula is there, because not every other story will have the opening formula. So look out for those ones, features that are unique to oral narratives. So read many stories and try to identify these features. Try to identify these features. Then maybe another thing I would want to look at is, how would you know that the audience is listening? You are the narrator. How would you know that the audience is listening? Maybe a reminder at this juncture is that you'd get an oral narrative for paper 1. You'd get an oral narrative for paper 2. So this one now is paper 1. How would you know that your audience is listening? Well, as you are narrating the story, you would find that some people in the audience are nodding their head. Yes, they are nodding their head. Others at some point to show that they agree. Yes, yes, they agree with you, or they agree with the narrator, or they are, Others could also clap. Maybe at some point there's triumph, so the audience would applaud. The audience would, yeah, clap or applaud. Others would laugh at humor if there is. It would be maybe even stamping of feet, saying, wow, who maybe at a triumph, for example, you'd sigh in relief. If, for example, there was tension and you realize the enemy has been captured, so you just sigh and say, wow. So all along there was suspense, and at some point maybe the enemy is captured and you say, oh, he has been captured. So you'd be able to tell that your audience is listening if they're doing this. Well, there is also what we call eye contact, but not just eye contact. It has to be meaningful eye contact. It should be meaningful eye contact. So maybe when we say meaningful, it is looking at the narrator to show that indeed they are following the story. Not simply looking at the narrator, maybe you are simply admiring the narrator and you are not following. So it should be meaningful eye contact that shows that indeed you are following what the narrator is saying. Okay, remember the poem, The Beard? Yeah, at the pulpit, when one of the preacher was preaching and one of the followers was simply looking at the preacher. And the preacher thought that this woman is looking at him because she would want to have her sins forgiven. Only yet, she was only looking at the person or the preacher because he had a beard that resembled that of our dead goat. So when I talk about meaningful, and that's why you need to add the word meaningful eye contact. It means that you are following, you are looking at the gestures that the narrator is using, yeah, the movements. So therefore the word meaningful, in short, I want to say that the word meaningful there is very, very important. Now, there are many other ways of telling that the audience is following the narration, sitting in an upright posture, and not just upright. Upright also goes with leaning forward. So sitting in an upright posture and leaning forward. Now, if you are answering this question from a given story or narrative, it is very important that you give illustration. Illustrate from the context. Illustrate from the context. Yes, so that, for example, you'd say, the audience clapped. The audience clapped when the enemy was captured. So give meaning, or rather give illustrations according to the context. Then the next thing I would want to mention, there are many things we would mention about oral narratives, but for now, I would also want to talk about performance techniques. How would you perform? How would you perform the narrative? How would you make the story interesting? How would you make your story interesting? Again, illustrate from the context. And this is where we say use of gestures, tone of variation, and many others. Gestures, tone of variation, okay, body movement, voice projection. So all this. Stress, intonation, proper articulation. So these are what we call verbal skills. Verbal skills. So how would you perform? They are verbal and non-verbal. Remember, I think we have repeated this and we have said this again and again. When you get a question that is asking, how do you say? Yes, how do you say? Give both verbal and non-verbal. How do you perform? Again, give both verbal and non-verbal. I think those ones that I've mentioned are just verbal. We still have non-verbal cues. Yes, okay. Use of gestures that maybe I should mention them in order. Voice projection, that is verbal. It has to do with the voice. Tone of variation also has to do with the voice. Stress has to do with the voice. Intonation has to do with voice. Proper articulation. Yeah. So I would raise my voice. Yes. Non-verbal cues, or what you'd, yeah, in some questions you find questions like, what paralinguistic features would you use? So paralinguistic, it is those ones that you'd use together with the narration. Those that you'd use together with the narration. It simply means the non-verbal cues, the non-verbal cues. Okay, facial expressions. And when you talk about facial expression, whichever cue you identify, illustrate. For example, use of gestures. You'd talk about stretch your hand, or wave at the audience, or wave at the whoever, depending on the story that you are discussing. Then clapping. Yeah, that is simple clapping. That is again a gesticulation, pointing. So it will depend which is the most appropriate, which is the most appropriate. Okay. Then raising your hands, spreading. For example, if we are trying to imitate an eagle, you'd say spreading your hands to show that you are flying. So spreading your hands, this is a gesture. So don't simply say a gesture. So use of gesture and then go ahead and explain the gesture that you use. Explain the gesture that you use. Facial expression. So which are those facial expressions? I'm sure you can mention a few. Yeah, smiling. Yeah, which other ones? Laughing. Okay, frowning, blinking, eye contact, winking. So all these are facial expressions. So sometimes we note that candidates are quick to see that the question is very easy. And you simply write use of gestures, use of body movement. Well, mention clearly which body movement, which gesture are you using here? So you must specify, you must illustrate from the context. Okay, then other nonverbal cues include pregnant pauses or significant pauses. For example, when you want to create suspense, you can use that pregnant pause. There's also imitating. You can imitate an animal or mimicry. That is also another. Like I said, this is revision. And we know all this. We need to remind ourselves. Go for those stories. I'm sure you have a lot of revision material. Get those revision material. Revise. They may seem easy, but answer them as expected. Easy they may be, but make sure that you illustrate well. And remember, I think this one we had in the exam that we did at the beginning of last term, when you're saying, how do you make the story interesting? How do you make, or how do you perform that line? Remember, if you can remember what we said as we were revising, you must begin with the words, I would use gestures. So don't simply say gestures. You have to explain using words. English is language. So explain using words. Don't simply say gestures. So say, I would use gestures. And then go ahead and say, I would beckon for him to come. So that is it. Then, like I said, when you asked, how do you say? Use verbal and non-verbal cues. Or how do you perform? Use verbal and non-verbal cues. There is a tendency to simply think that say simply means verbal. No. So any question that asks, how do you say? It should cover both verbal and non-verbal. Okay. Then another thing I would want us to look at, I would want us to look at an example here. And we have a narrative here that I would want us to discuss. I hope it is ready on your wall. A narrative that I would want us to discuss in the next 20 minutes, if possible. And then we will see, does it have the features that we have mentioned? How would we be able to perform it? Yeah, How would we know that our audience is listening? So if it is possible, I would like that on the wall so that we can discuss. I hope it's possible. So take the next 20 minutes. I believe the narrative has been sent. Go through it, and then we'll go through it together. ndio lile linapotea. Good year. Kwa hivyo hata hawajashika hiyo document. Hello. Sawa. So nimeona Francis Wachira ni Do you want to change the host to Francis? Yes. Please. Oh, okay. Hello.
Sorry for the technical problem. Now you can check the document that the teacher wanted you to read and answer the question at the end of it. After you are done reading, I'll put you in a breakout room of about 10 people each. Yeah, 10 people each discuss about this. Yes, Brian?
Excuse me, can you please zoom in?
Okay, okay. Mm. Mm. Is it okay now? Inaonekana vizuri kwa screen yako? Is it okay? Okay. 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 I'll just tell them to raise the hand. Can continue, Madam Agnes.
Okay. Hello once again. In the interest of time, I'm sure you have gone through that story. I would like us to look at question 1 and 2, if possible, together, and then I'll give the assignment. Question 1, categorize the narrative. What type of narrative is it? You can raise up your hand and you give us the answers. What type of narrative is this?
It's an organ narrative.
Good. Give us the reasons. Why do you say it is an organ narrative?
Oh, it's an organ narrative because in the story we find there is an ogre. There is an ogre, and the story revolves around. I don't know how to explain it.
Go ahead.
Oh, I believe because it talks about an ogre.
It talks about an ogre. Specific illustration. Maybe somebody can mention. Continue from there. Another person.
If you go back in the story where the ogre went to relieve himself, and then Ateke saw the ogre staring at her.
All right. That's Kamenjo.
Yeah.
Oh, good. So she saw the ogre staring at her. Right. Okay, so it is important that you mention the line exactly from the way it is in the story. Yeah, we are also able to know, you can simply say Osukutuku is an ogre. Yeah, and then give the sentence, leave not me behind, son. The ogre shouted. Okay, so illustration is very, very important. So let's look at the features of oral narratives in this story, the ones you are able to identify. Which features of oral narratives were you able to identify?
This use of dialogue.
Right.
Example when the ogre goes for the hand in marriage, the dialogue between the mother and the ogre.
Yes. So there's use of dialogue, we all agree. There's a conversation between the ogre and his prospective mother-in-law, but we are not yet there for our full mark. Yeah. So for example, that question was carrying 2 marks, so far 1. So what else do we need to say?
Let's see.
Now, what I would say is it is also very important that you quote the lines. You have mentioned the speakers, yeah, the speakers, and then the lines. For example, greetings to you, mother-in-law, and then what makes you think that you can live, that you can have my daughter. So you should identify the speakers and then the lines used. Another illustration.
Dialogue. This is a dialogue. We have a dialogue.
Now your hand is up and your mic is on.
Yeah, teacher, I have another feature.
Yes, continue. Good.
So in this story, the ogre, which represents, the evil in the society, is always defeated. And in this story, we see the ogre is killed by a young man who sprang out of the bush when he is about to swallow a ticket.
Mm-hmm. That is Leon. Who is this?
Abdulmajid.
Okay. The ogre is killed. So evil is defeated. Evil is defeated. What would we call this? Maybe we did not mention it in the many features we mentioned, but it is important. What is this? There's a what? Moral lesson. There's a moral lesson. Yeah. So evil will eventually be defeated. So there is a moral lesson. Evil will eventually be defeated. Then go ahead and give that illustration. So actually you can add that to the features. I mentioned the most prominent ones. Otherwise, that is also a feature. Very good. Any other? Any other? Any other?
There is also use of fantasy
Fantasy, very good.
because ogres are not real.
Again?
Ogres are not actual creatures. The writers use this imagination to bring these creatures into life, meaning this is an oral narrative.
Very good. Very good. Ogres are a creation of human imagination. They are not real. They are not real. Good. Do you have any other? Any other feature of oral narrative here?
There's the closing formula, and they lived
Yes.
happily ever after.
Very good. Very good. That is good. I think those were the main ones in the story, unless somebody thinks there is another. Okay, let's go to question 3. Question 3. Question 3. How do you perform? No, how do you know that the audience is listening? Question 3. Let's look at question 3. How do you? That's so. You are the narrator. How do you know that the audience is listening? How would you tell that the audience is listening? Is that the question we are looking at? If you are the narrator of the above, yeah, how would you know that your audience is listening? Can somebody give us an answer?
When the ogre is attacked before the ogre is attacked by the young man, you could see you'll notice a sigh of relief after it's attacked by the handsome young man.
Very good, very good. Because you have to give specific illustration from the context, illustrate from the context. Very good. How else would you know that your audience is listening?
We expect to see that the audience will be shocked after the ogre comes from the bush to relieve himself. That's a change of mood of the of the audience where be shocked.
They express shock.
Because was initially a handsome man, then he comes back as an ogre.
Right. How do you express shock? How do you express shock?
Using facial expression of okay, you widen your eyes, widen your eyes or something like that, and mouth agape.
Okay, Manasseh, you open your eyes wide. Open your eyes wide, and gasp. Gasp in shock. What you're saying, opening your mouth wide, yeah. All right, yeah, we agree. So that is when, repeat that, maybe you need to repeat that. At what point?
At that point whereby the audience, I mean the ogre comes from the bush and gone to the bush as a handsome man, then comes back as an ogre.
Right. So when Akeke realizes that it is an ogre staring at her, so at that time you'd gasp in shock, or you'd open your eyes wide in shock or surprise. Very good, very good. Anything else that we would say here?
I also think that if the audience, as you had explained earlier, maintains meaningful eye contact, that may give you a hint that the audience is listening to the narrative.
Very good, very good, very good. Okay, I'm sure we still have more. Any other?
Yes. The audience may clap in appreciation of a character in the story. In our story, when the young man kills the ogre, the audience may clap, and this shows their attentiveness.
Very good. They would clap. They would clap. When the young man throws a spear that struck the ogre dead, so they would clap. Evil has been defeated. The enemy has been killed. They would clap. They would applaud. Yeah. Or even at that. Yes, please. Go ahead.
I also think that they would also clap at the end of the narrative.
At what point? Or how does it end?
When they say, and they lived happily ever after, the audience will clap will clap to thank for the narrative to them.
Right. They lived happily ever after. They would clap in joy. It is nice. They would be full of joy. They lived happily ever after. Unless there's something to add. Even at that time when a voice comes from the bush, not anymore. Not anymore. Yeah, they would know that now help is coming. Very good. And finally,
I have a question.
A question, please.
At the beginning of the narrative, we see that the ogre is trying to tell a figure of its own kind that don't leave me. Is that ogre dying or something like that?
At the beginning, so the ogre says of its kind, don't leave me. We can all look at that. Let me have a look at it. First paragraph, so that we can look at it clearly. And if somebody is able to answer that question, we can do so.
I think you should scroll the screen sharing up.
Technical team. Ashira can do that for us. Ashira can scroll so that we get the first paragraph. Okay, all the same, I can still read for you. I'm now almost leaving this world, and it hurts me because you, my son, seem to be leaving earlier. Leave not me behind, son, the ogre shouted to another of his looks who lay on the ground. So the question you're asking is it dying?
Yeah.
I'm now almost, can somebody comment on that one? I believe we have all the phone calls, 300 and above. Let me hear a comment. It's long since I heard from you. Somebody answer Manasseh that question. Okay, if no answer, I would say it's as if he's dying. I'm now almost leaving this world and it hurts me. I agree with you, Manasseh. Right?
Yes.
Okay. Then the last question, because we have like 6 minutes. The last question. How would you say the last line? How would you say the last line? Let me hear answers from you.
Falling intonation. With a falling intonation to signify finality.
Repeat.
Falling.
Falling intonation. We need to know the reason why you'd use falling intonation. Falling intonation. Anybody whose hand is up?
To signify finality. I'm sorry, I was muted.
Okay, okay. To signify finality. And the finality here is what?
Happy ending of living happily ever after.
They lived happily ever after. And I want you to note the question. How do you say the last line? The last line. So the first thing you need to do is to identify that first line. They lived happily ever after. So always identify the line so that as you are giving your answer, we know what you are talking, which line you're talking about. So identify it. Yeah, we agree. But that is part of it. Much more.
I would stress on the words "they lived happily ever after" to show the victory that the young man in Ateke had on the ogre.
So the words lived
Happily ever after.
To show
the victory Ateke and the young man had over the ogre.
Very good. Stress those words. They lived happily ever after. So that everybody can hear that it ended well. Very good. Remember the question, how do you say? 2 marks. We only have 1 mark so far. Where do we get our second point from?
Teacher, you can, I will say this last line with a happy tone.
A happy tone, right? A happy tone. You'd use a happy tone because of living, to show the joy of living happily. Good. Happy tone. Anything else? Any other words we'd use? Yeah, you would smile. They lived happily ever after. Good. You'd smile. So oral narratives is that. But sometimes we ignore those simple answers. So do not ignore every part of a question. finally. Is there a question before I give my questions? Anybody who has a question? We have 2 minutes.
Yes, madam.
Yes.
I was asking, are facial expressions part of nonverbal cues?
Yes. Facial expressions are non-verbal because it is a smile.
So the
It is
second point,
a frown.
so the second point will come from saying that you could smile in the
Yeah.
previous question.
So the first
Okay.
one was falling to express finality, while the other one is the non-verbal.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Location. So, what's the difference between if you are told how are you going to say it, and how are you going to perform?
How are you going to say? I said it is going to cover both verbal and non-verbal. I remember at some point there was this tendency to think that how do you say is only verbal, but it takes both verbal and non-verbal. How would you say? Because when you're saying something, you should also think about how would you express yourself non-verbally. So actually those two, say or perform, expect the same kind of an answer. Clear?
Yeah.
Yes. Assignment. And this is mainly for question 2. Think about this question. Who is a suitable audience for the narrative? Who is a suitable audience for the narrative? You can write it down. What aspects of social life are highlighted in the narrative? So aspects of social life. So these are the questions you expect in paper 2. Features of this, question 3, or the points you are going to get from your notes. Features of this type of narrative evident in this story, because this in particular is an Oga narrative. So what unique features of Oga narratives are in this story? Time is up. It was nice hearing from you. We apologize for the technical hitches, but I'm sure it will be better next time. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best in your revision.